Hello and welcome to my channel. I built a studio. No, don't look that way. Anyways, I'm building a Volkswagen engine, and not just any Volkswagen engine, a freaking 1776. So I'm very unfamiliar with Volkswagen engines. This is actually the first one I'm building. So with that being said, this video is not really a how-to video, but more of me sharing my experience with you, the people, on me building this engine. So all you Volkswagen experts out there, if I did great on this build, please let me know down in the comments. If I did horrible, well, please let me know down in the comments. With that being said, let me show you what I have here. So let's start with the case. This is a stock 1600 case that's been align bored and machined to fit 90.5 millimeter pistons. I also went ahead and drilled and tapped the oil galley plugs for me to be able to install NPT plugs. For the rotating assembly, we're going to reuse the stock crank and rods. The passages have been cleaned out and I went ahead and got the journals polished. For the cam, we're using an Engle W100 with an MP aluminum gear. The cam has 420 lift, 276 duration, and 108 lobe centers. To make this a 1776, we are using A&A Performance Products 1776 piston and cylinder kit. This kit uses 90.5 millimeter hypereutectic pistons. And to top it off, we're going to be using A&A Performance Products high performance cylinder heads. These are brand new castings with single heavy duty springs and stainless steel valves. So we have all these parts plus any of the miscellaneous parts such as the bearings, the cam plug, bolts, and others. And all the machine work was done by Greg at Performance Workshop, so a huge shout out to him. So I'm gonna go ahead and begin with the crank. So let me clear out this table. Wow, that was cool. Oh, and to bring you guys closer to the build, I'm gonna be wearing a GoPro. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is take this range out that I got from my local thrift store. Hopefully it works. Now, the plan for this is to get this gear, put it on here, and heat it up. Well, I'm not sure if that's working. If that doesn't work, we have a plan B. So I'm gonna go ahead and install this bearing right now. From what I've always been told is that this hole faces the flywheel. I'm gonna go ahead and coat the bearing with some assembly lube. Dot towards the flywheel. Put that on first. Okay. Yep, this thing's not working. Nice. Spacer goes on next. I'm not sure if this has a direction of how this goes, but I'm gonna assume that this part is the inside. Now I'm gonna go ahead and install the snap ring.
Two hours later.
Wow, that was not easy to do, but I did it. Woo, let's go. Okay, so now we're gonna install the front bearing right here. Like I said earlier, hole towards the back. And this goes on over. This key weight goes in. Yep, that looks like that's in. Now I'm gonna go ahead and start installing the connecting rods. Now, if you pictured your case right next to you, wow, okay. The bore that's closest to you, which is gonna be this one right here, that's where I'm gonna lay my crank to be positioned as. Allow me to explain. So I'm gonna set the crank down right here. So my number one connecting rod is gonna be facing out this way, number two, this way, number three, this way, number four, this way. If we look at this case, you can see this bore is further back than this one. So that's why I have the crank positioned in the way I do. So that way this journal is pointing away towards that side. Hope that makes sense. Now, from my understanding, these tangs right here are facing down and these nubs are facing up if you have the nubs on your stock connecting rods. So I'm gonna go ahead and start throwing bearings on these rods. I'm gonna separate these caps And do not mix these caps between the rods because these are machined to their very own rod. And if you mix the caps, well, you're gonna put it on the crank and your rods are not gonna spin. So let's see. I went ahead and stamped these. So this is my number 4 rod.
Ignore the numbers, I have them in the wrong order.
So I'll go ahead and put it further away from the bench, right here. This is my number 2 rod. There, this is my number 1 rod. There, and I'm assuming this is my number 3. Yep. Okay, so I got my rod bearings. I'm gonna go ahead and take them out of the packaging. Basically, you get it on the tank side first, and we're gonna slide that in, like so, and you can see how flat that is. Same thing on the connecting rod. Tang in first, and basically just slide it in, and they're pretty flush. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with the number 1 rod. Put some assembly lube on this. Both tangs are facing down, nub facing up. I'll put the rod on first. Now I got my torque wrench. I'm gonna go ahead and torque this down to 35 foot-pounds. So obviously I was struggling, so I went ahead and put the flywheel on, and this should make it way easier to torque. Okay, so now I'm gonna get my rod number 2. So referencing my first rod, you can see the nub is facing away from me towards you guys. Do the same thing for the rest of the rods. And make sure tangs are facing towards me. Go ahead and evenly torque this rod down. And now we have a completely assembled crank. So I'm gonna go ahead and put on this last main bearing right here. Dot towards the flywheel. So now I'm gonna go ahead and slide this out of the way and start working on the cam, getting this put together. Go ahead and open up the packaging here. So this doesn't really give me any indication of what position this gear should be on the cam, so I have an idea. So here's the old cam. So I'm gonna be looking for this dot right there and look at where the lobes are at and try to copy that with this cam. Dot is right here, goes here. Put 1 bolt in here just to hold it into place. So now both of the dots are facing up, and if I look at the cam, all the lobes are facing the same direction. So this is the position that I'm gonna leave this cam gear on. So I'm gonna go ahead and spray this gear off. Now I'm gonna spray the cam off. Whoa. So I'm gonna go ahead and get some red thread locker on these bolts. I'm gonna torque these down to 20. Okay, now my rotating assembly is ready to go into the block. So I'm gonna go ahead and install this center bearing right here. Throw some lube here. I'm gonna rotate these until the crank kind of just falls into place. There we go. So one way I've seen people check to see if the crank is seated fully is they get this other half of the bearing, they put it down here. As you can see, mine rocks a bit, so it needs to be seated a little more. And now it doesn't rock anymore. So that means this crank is fully seated. I'll remove this bearing. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and start installing the lifters. I'm gonna take one out, throw some lube on it. Okay, so I was about to install the cam, but this kind of threw me in for a loop. So I was about to put in the cam bearings and I noticed that both cam bearings have a tang. And this case half does not have a tang, but the other case half does have a tang. So from what I've read, people file these down. I don't know how I feel about that. I'd prefer to make a tang into the block, but obviously I have everything together and I do not want to create any metal shavings that could fall into the oil passage or get anywhere. So I'm gonna go ahead, at least for this build, I'm gonna go ahead and file this tang down and get these cam bearings installed. Alright, here we go. Went ahead and filed this tang off. And you can see it is perfectly flat. You do not want any bump here or else that's gonna push the bearing up and reduce your clearances. I'm gonna throw some thicker assembly grease on the lifters. This will help with the camshaft. I'm gonna go ahead and lower the camshaft to its spot while aligning the timing marks on the crank and the camshaft. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you guys my timing marks. So there are 2 dots that are on the crankshaft. You can see them right there. And there's 1 dot on the camshaft. You basically make them look like that. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but when you're putting on this crank gear, make sure those dots are on the outside, because if they're on the inside, then you won't know how to time this thing. Now before I put this case half on, I have the bearings already installed. I need to install the lifters. Unfortunately, I do not have any clips, but I do have this stuff, and this is assembly glue, and this stuff is actually very, very thick, and it says it's good for engines, so I'm gonna trust them on that. I'm gonna go ahead and coat around these lifters, and I already have one in there just to make sure, and it's staying in place, so I think we should be good with that. I'm gonna go ahead and start putting the case halves together using this stuff. I'm gonna start here where the cam plug goes. So I tried not to put a lot, but I know it kind of looks like a lot, so the only place I feel I put too much is around the cam plug, but hopefully that's okay. So go ahead and get these rods, kind of push them towards each other so they stay up like that. Got all the bearings greased. that looks like it went together pretty well. Get a rubber mallet. Tap those together. Crankshaft still rotates, at least for now. So I'm gonna go ahead and start putting the washers in for these 6 bolts. A little bit of sealer. So these are going to get torqued to 23 foot-pounds. We'll do kind of a crisscross pattern. Will my crankshaft rotate? It does, and it rotates nice and smooth. Sweet. And these nuts get torqued down to 16 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna go ahead and install the studs for the heads. I know that the long ones go on the bottom, and the 2 medium-sized ones go on the outside, and the 2 short ones go on the inside. So I'm gonna go ahead and use some Permatex thread sealer. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and check ring gap and deck height. So I've already taken care of all the cylinders except for this one right here. And this one's gonna be my number 1 cylinder. So I'm gonna go ahead and start taking off the rings. This is a ring tool by Lyle. Basically you put it on here, expand the ring just enough to remove it. There we go. And for the oil rings, we don't need the tool. We could actually do it by our hand. Okay, I'm gonna start with the number 1 ring right here. I'm gonna go ahead and insert this ring. And be careful with these rings because these rings are very sharp and you could cut yourself. So with the ring in, I'm gonna go ahead and get the piston. It helps having another ring inside the piston because it'll allow you to square the ring a lot better. But since I don't have any of the rings in, I'm just gonna eyeball it. And the way I'm gonna eyeball it is look at the ring land and make sure it's even on both sides. And it looks pretty even. So I would say that's pretty square. For the spec, it says that the ring gap is supposed to be 12 to 18 thousandths. So I'm gonna get my feeler gauge and pull out the 12 thousandths. And you want like a slight drag, and this is actually pretty much 12 thousandths. So we're good here. I'll go ahead and take that ring out. I'm gonna start doing the second one. Again, I'm gonna use the piston to square it. Like I said, it's best to have a ring already inside the piston to make squaring it a lot easier. Because if you don't have any rings, these pistons can actually move side to side and you could get incorrect readings. Okay, and that fits in that gap, so we're good there. Time to check the oil rings now. So it looks like all of our rings are in spec. Like I said, I've already checked the other cylinders and all the rings, thankfully, were in spec and I didn't need to file them. Now, if any of your rings were too tight, you will need a file like this one right here. Or if you got the machinery, they make a machine to cut these rings. There'd be like a disc and you would push it into the machine. And that's how it would file the rings. And since I don't have that, I would use a file like this and basically just get one side and just start filing it side to side. Once I get that filed, I want to make sure to remove all the burrs on the edges of where I filed. And that should be it. Now I'm going to check deck height. And basically what I want to do is I want to make sure that I am at top dead center on the number 1 cylinder, since that's the one I'm checking. So I'm going to get my piston and my wrist pin. Put it all the way through. And I'm not going to install it 100% since I'm only checking deck height. Just going to leave it like that. And make sure the cylinder is fully seated in the block. There we go. Now I'm going to double check, make sure I'm at top dead center. I'm going to eyeball it and see. Piston will come up and it'll get to its highest point. You can also check to make sure that this rod right here is all the way at the bottom. And if you want to be very accurate, they make a dial indicator that you can set right here and it can magnetize to whatever location you want it. But I don't have that. I'm just gonna eyeball it. And that looks like it's top dead center right there. Check out what I made. Okay, I was getting into doing this, but I realized my GoPro wasn't recording for some reason. So let me go over again what I'm doing here. So this, I'm measuring deck height. And this is a plate I made. I measured the thickness. And basically what I'm doing is I'm measuring how low the piston is compared to the top of the cylinder. So the way I'm checking that is basically getting the depth of inside this hole and subtracting it by this number right here, and that'll give me my deck height. So I have these dial calipers right here. And by the way, these are torqued to the cylinder head torque, which is 23 foot-pounds, and these are the spacers for the studs. So now I'm gonna go ahead and put these here and make that flat and flush. And we are at 413 thousandths of an inch. So doing some math, we're gonna subtract it here, and that is gonna use my phone for some quick math. And that comes up to 45 thousandths of an inch. So I'm gonna go ahead and write that on my cylinder right here so I remember. Okay, so my deck height should be 55 to 60 thousandths. So since I'm too shallow, that means I need shims. All the other cylinders that I measured, they were ranging from 35 thousandths to 45 thousandths. So getting some shims will increase that deck height and get the compression ratio to the right spec. So I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day and get those shims tomorrow. So I'll be back. And I'm back with the shims. So I'm gonna go ahead and start reassembling my piston. I'm gonna start with the scraper ring. Just get it around the piston here, like that. So these do not have a direction of where they're supposed to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and install this one on the bottom. Okay, got one ring on the bottom. I'm gonna do the ring on the top. Now, the second ring, you can see how this ring has a marking and it says top 2. The other one says top 1. That means the top is facing the top, and the number goes to whatever ring land. So we're going to start with the number 2 ring. As we can see the letters on the top. I'm going to put it in the tool. Spread it just enough to go over the piston. Don't want to go too far or else you run the risk of breaking these rings. There we go, just like that. We got 1 ring in. And then the last ring, the top ring. There we go. Now, before I install this piston into the cylinder, I do need to make sure that all these gaps are not lined up with each other. So I'm going to start with the bottom ring. I want to make this bottom ring on this side. Then the second bottom ring, or I guess the top oil ring. While I'm holding the bottom oil ring, I'm going to slide the top oil ring 180 degrees. And the second compression ring is going to be on this side of the wrist pin. And then the top compression ring is going to be on this side of the wrist pin. So all these gaps are 90 degrees away from each other. So we got that one there, that one there, this one here, and this one here. So put some oil on the rings and get those rings nice and coated. Then I'm gonna go ahead and put this in my piston ring compressor. Get the cylinder, get some oil, and oil down the walls a little bit. Okay, so this ring compressor I got from Harbor Freight, so this was very inexpensive. So how this works is that this is kind of like a coil of sheet metal, and it's ratcheting, so you could pretty much tighten it. So you want to start with the piston towards the top of this. So these two are on the bottom. This is the top area. We want the piston to start up here because we want this to kind of taper in a way, because since these bands are on the bottom, it's going to tighten here more than the top, which will make installing the piston in the cylinder a lot easier. And get it pretty much as tight as you could. And I'm going to go ahead and push the piston down. And go a little more. There we go. So we'll go ahead. I got some of my pistons sticking out now, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the cylinder. And what I want to look out for is the direction the arrow is pointing. So this is my number 1 cylinder. That means the flat side is facing towards the bell housing or towards the flywheel. So I'm going to turn where this arrow right here is pointed towards that direction too. So that way I'm not trying to rotate it once I get the piston in here. So last step before I get this piston completely in here, you can see that coil of sheet metal is kind of not lined up. So I'm gonna go ahead and tap it with the hammer, go around, and getting this nice and seated to the cylinder. And you can hear the pitch change as it's already hitting the cylinder. So now I'm gonna put my hand, put quite a bit of pressure on here. I do not want this ring compressor to pop up. So I'm gonna go ahead and start tapping this piston in. And there we go. Piston is in, nice and smooth. Now, we'll go ahead and start installing all the cylinders onto the block. So for the bottom of the cylinders, I'm gonna use some Permatex Ultra Gray, some RTV. Pretty much use any RTV, black probably works well too. So I'm gonna go ahead and put some around the cylinder. spread it a bit with my finger. Then now I'm gonna get one of my shims and make sure it's the right orientation. It looks like this is the orientation it's supposed to be at. Probably should have put the shim on before putting the RTV on. Oh well. I'll go ahead and kind of spread the RTV a bit again around. I'm gonna go ahead and wipe any RTV off that I got inside the cylinder. I'll go ahead and grab the hammer, start tapping this piston down until I have access to the wrist pins. There we go. I don't want to take it too far because obviously I don't want to pop the rings back out. Get some assembly lube. Put some in here. Put some in here. And also in the small end of the rod. Probably a little bit on here too. Okay, so now I'm gonna grab the cylinder. I jumped the gun a little bit. Forgot to install the snap ring on the other side. It's okay, I can still install it right now. So get yourself a nice pair of snap ring pliers. This one's just a Craftsman I got. Make sure that's seated in that ring groove. Okay, that looks pretty good. Go ahead and slide that wrist pin all the way in. Grab the other snap ring. We'll go ahead and slide the cylinder down. I'm gonna go ahead and do the number 1 cylinder first. This time I'll put the shim on, throw some RTV on. Okay, now put this upside down like this, and I'm gonna grab the other set of snap rings. And before I do that, I'm gonna add some more lube. So the flat side of my number 1 cylinder is gonna get the snap ring first, because obviously if I put that cylinder on, I won't have access to it. There we go. Now I'm gonna grab my wrist pin. Slide that in here. That snap ring is now seated right. And now, one of the most important steps is putting this shield on. All right, I had to look at a quick video to see how to install these guys, and kind of confusing, but basically we need to get the bottom end in first. Okay, and pretty much slide it down, getting around this nut right here. That looks like it's supposed to be there. All right, so now pushrod tubes. I'm gonna need 4 of these for now. I don't need this anymore. So I'll go ahead and slide these guys in. So I'm gonna oil these a little bit so that way they kind of seat a lot better. I've seen people put sealer. I don't think it's necessary to put sealer on these things. I'm gonna go ahead and install the cylinder head. Careful lowering the cylinder head down. Let me actually set these out before I install those. Okay, cool. Now I'm gonna get my pushrod tubes. Get them to where they need to go. A little too far. Ah! Don't go anywhere. You guys didn't see that. I didn't even see that. Now I'm going to install these washers, install these nuts. I'm gonna go ahead and get these on each stud. So now I'm gonna go ahead and torque these. I'll go ahead and start at 10. Some people do 7. I think as long as you get these torqued down pretty evenly. So I'm not gonna go to 10 here, but I'm just gonna get these to feel the same. I'm gonna be doing a crisscross pattern. Okay. Oh yeah, those feel a lot better. Okay, so now I'm going to start with 10 foot-pounds right here. There you go. There's that click. There's a click. 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 So now, the last sequence, I'm going to do cylinder head torque, which is 23 foot-pounds. There you go. I'm going to start all over again just to make sure everything is nice and tight. All right, and that's one cylinder head on. Now, time to do the other side. Okay, so for the oil pump, I'm not going to go with the standard oil pump that these come with. I'm actually going to go with one with a oil filter adapter, so that way I could maximize the life of this engine. So this one pretty much mounts here, and the filter would be sideways. So many of you guys know that these filters can get really close to the exhaust, and I do have a plan for that. I'm gonna use some heat shielding and kind of form around the oil filter. That way there's no heat being transferred over to the filter and heating up the oil. So basically what we're gonna do now is take these nuts off, because these nuts are only together to hold this whole assembly together. Actually, before I take these off, I'm gonna take these studs off, so that way it's ready to be threaded on. So hopefully with some pliers, I'm able to take these studs off. If not, we'll see what to do. So I'm going to be upgrading this rocker arm assembly with these new parts. So these right here are some swivel feet from Scat, and we have some of these shims. Now these actually replace the spring washers that are inside the rocker shafts here to prevent any side-to-side movement. So it helps increase RPM and increases stability. So I'm going to go ahead and start tearing this apart, starting with removing these springs right here. And it helps taking a picture of the whole thing, that way you guys remember how to put this back together. I've already done one of these, so this one shouldn't be too bad. These, I probably should have left them on to take these nuts off, but oh well. Okay, now all my parts are clean. I'll go ahead and start by taking these out of the packaging. Okay. And then next I'm going to install these guys right here in the first two middle slots. There we go. Install one of these washers here, one of these here, another one here, and a rocker. Well, first, before I put the rocker on, I'll get some oil. Get these lubed up before I put them on here. And then the stand. Let's see how I have the stands on this one. Okay, they're facing. So I have the notch facing away from me like this. That there. There you go. For some reason I had to tap these in, but once they get to their spots, they move freely. Now if they don't, that's a problem. They're supposed to move. Now we put the last set of washers on. And then the clip. Now time to do the other side. Alright, this is now assembled. I'm going to go ahead and install the feet. Put these upside down. Start threading these on by hand. And I'm not going to screw these nuts all the way, because I still need to adjust these when these are on the engine. Now this is ready to be installed on the head. This whole video, I've been saying the wrong sequence, and I just realized it when I got to this step. So before I was thinking that this was cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I'm completely wrong. I kind of just assumed that because I've been used to the Chevy stuff. But for the Volkswagen stuff, this is cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, to find top dead center, I'm going to be rotating the crank and watching these rockers. So top dead center should be on the compression stroke of the engine, which means no valves are being pressed. So as you can see, when I rotate the engine, I have my exhaust valve opening. That means all the exhaust gases are being let out. Followed by that should be the intake valve opening. As you can see, that's opening. And it isn't about till now where I'm going to be on the compression stroke. So now that valve just closed, I'm going to stick my screwdriver in to the spark plug hole and start pushing the piston up until I see this screwdriver slowly come to a stop. And right about there is where it is at the very top of the stroke. So no valves are being pressed. The piston is all the way up according to the screwdriver. That means I'm at top dead center. So I'm gonna go ahead and install my distributor right now. It also helps to look at your crank pulley and make sure it lines up with the seam of the engine. Now you cannot solely rely on this, because every 2 revolutions the crankshaft makes is 1 revolution for the camshaft. So it's very important to know the positioning of your valves. So now I'm gonna go ahead and install my distributor drive gear. So it was at this point of the video where I made a critical mistake. So I decided to put the washers on the drive gear before I installed the gear. And I held them in using some assembly grease, not knowing that when I drop the drive gear in, those washers get in the way and not allow the drive gear to mesh with the gear on the crank. So when I dropped it into the engine, I realized it got stuck. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I have to at least admit it. I went ahead and slightly tapped it with a hammer, and that's when I realized that I made a very bad mistake, and I chipped away a bit of the distributor gear on the crank. So I had to take the whole entire engine apart and take the gear off, put a new one in, and reassemble it. The drive gear is installed in the engine. Here I dropped the spring that goes on top of it. Then I dropped the distributor. Now I'm going to be measuring crankshaft end play. So in order to do that, I have set up a dial indicator right here on my flywheel, and I torqued down the bolt to 235 foot-pounds, which is what the book says. And basically what we're going to do, I have no shims installed right now, but when I move the crank back and forth, it moves about 30 thousandths of an inch. So spec calls for 3 to 5 thousandths, so we're gonna need some shims. So here I have two shims, and they both measure together at just over 25 thousandths, which would give me the space I need to be in spec. Now with those shims in there, I have 5 thousandths end play, which is in spec, so this is good to go. Now I'm going to be setting up the valve train. So here I have an adjustable push rod. I'm using this because I'm going to be cutting new push rods. The swivel feet kit came with 8 shims. I'm using 2 shims on each stud. So the way I'm setting this up is torquing the rocker shafts down to spec, turning the adjuster half a turn in, and then adjusting the push rod where I have 0 lash, meaning the rocker cannot move up and down. Once I achieve that, I remove the rocker arms, take my adjustable push rod, and size it with my new chromoly push rods. From there, I cut the push rods, hammer the ends together, then I'll have a complete set of new chromoly push rods. So there are 2 things you want to look out for when setting these up. You want to make sure that the bottom of the swivel feet case is not touching the valve stem right here. You also want to make sure that the face of the feet is not too high on the valve stem. You don't want that to be hanging off. Now for the shims, the closer the rocker arm is to the engine, less shims will result in the bottom of the swivel feet hitting the valve stem. And the more shims you add, the higher the feet will end up being on the valve stem. So this is the middle ground right here. I'm watching the swivel feet to make sure that they stay relatively in the center of the valve stem. So as you guys can see, the engine is completely sealed up, and off camera I went ahead and put all the tin on. Now there's only one more thing to do, and this was kind of a last minute decision on the fuel system, and we're going to be going with some dual Webers. So this is a complete kit, and it comes with everything including the 240 IDFs. I'm going to be referring to the instruction manual right here, so bear with me. So the first thing I'm going to do is put some Loctite on these studs and install them on the manifolds. And I'm going to thread these in enough where it starts poking out from the bottom side. In the instructions it says I need to install a spacer on the linkage for the carburetor, and then install on the manifold, and then install the whole thing as one. I'm sure it says that because the engine would be in a car. Since I have the engine out, I'm gonna go ahead and install these manifolds first. And I have the gasket already in. Now the tin's making this a little bit difficult, but it just took some wiggling to get it in. Same thing for the other side. And then these will be torqued down to 14 foot-pounds. I'm going to install both gaskets and then the carburetor. Now the next step is to install this, and this has to be installed at a 60-degree angle. So the way I think about it is that each angle is a 30-degree increment. So if we put this at 90, and we go one step back, that'd be 60. So here are the ball ends. We're gonna install the jam nuts in all the way, and then we're gonna install them on the arms. Next, I'm gonna install these parts in this order, starting off with the gasket, then the crossbar bracket, then another gasket, air filter base, filter, and nuts. For this side, I put everything on except for the filter in the top, and I loosely put it on without any mounting hardware. And that's because in the instructions it says that we need to fit this rod in between here and here. But the problem that I'm having is that if I put it in right there, see how much longer that is? In the instructions it does say that you may need to cut 1/4 of an inch off of each side, but it looks like I'm gonna have to cut a little more than 1/4 inch off of each side. And as you guys can see, it's about 1 1/8 inches off. So I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting this rod up and making it fit. All right, so I went ahead and cut each side of the rod. I even chamfered it a little bit on the outside. And since this rod is not threaded all the way through, the threads stop like probably around here, I did have to cut some of the threads off of this bolt right here to make it fit. But now I got the right length for this rod and the right end play as well. This calls for 1/32 of an inch, which is pretty small. That's about 31 thousandths of an inch. Now I'm gonna change the linkages to the new ones. So I'm gonna start by unbending this tab right here. Then I'm gonna brace this arm a little bit and loosen this nut. Now the new hardware, this goes on first, then the arm, then this washer, then this, and lastly the nut. Bend the tab back in. Now I'm going to remove the idle screw from the back and move it to the front. Move it just enough where it barely touches this and moves it just slightly. Now on the passenger side carburetor, it's almost the same process, just backwards. Watch out for the spring washer right there. Make sure to keep that in place. Now the new bracket, get the spring, put it in there. The bracket in position, then rotate the spring to its spot. You do this by hand. All right, so the correct linkages are now installed. And for these parts, the short one goes on the passenger side and the long one goes on the driver's side. And if we look in the back, that's good right there. And that's good right there. So we no longer have these in the back. I also installed these links right here. So finally, this is gonna go on the engine. I already went ahead and put the springs in both sides. I'm gonna start with putting the left side in. Getting the right side bracket, putting it in like that. Slowly and carefully lowering it down. Tighten these by hand. Alright guys, I went ahead and put the filter on and the cap. Went ahead and also put the springs on back here. This throttle mechanism is working fine and this thing is completely done. In an upcoming video, we're gonna throw this on the dyno and seeing how much power we could push out of this whopping 1776. Those of you guys who stayed all the way to the end, thank you very much for staying. This build was a long process for me. This actually took a longer than I expected, but it's finally done and it's ready to run. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you guys want to see more content, feel free to subscribe. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.